Welcome back to another episode of Why Do I Do That? Today's episode, the question is, why do I say nothing is wrong when something is definitely wrong? And I feel like most women can relate to this, and probably a lot of men too, that ask their wives, partners, girlfriends, what's wrong? And they say, nothing's wrong. And you can tell that they're fucking pissed off, but you just don't actually know what's happening or why. So why do we do that? Why do we say nothing's wrong when something is actually wrong? And again, I'm going to break it down into a few different key points because I think there's a few different reasons for this. The first one is, for me, I feel like so many women that I speak to, they want their partners to just know. They want you to just know. And I speak to my clients. I've had hundreds of clients who say to me, I just want them to know what they've done wrong. I want them to just know what's going on with me, or just know what they should do or what they shouldn't do, or to just know what the issue is. And it's kind of funny, like we assume that somebody else should just know what's going on inside our heads when we all think so differently, especially men to women. We definitely think differently, but just person to person, like what you find offensive and what you find upsetting is different to what somebody else might find upsetting. We've all got our own triggers. We've all got our own past, our own wounds. So it's so difficult for your partner to just know what's going on inside your head, what's triggered you, what's upset you, because that thing potentially doesn't upset them. It doesn't bother them. It's not an issue for them. And I've had this in my own relationship where there's things that trigger me and my partner would be like, oh, I get it, but I don't have that. Like that wouldn't bother me if that happened. So we can't expect anybody to mind read and to just know what our problem is. So a lot of the time when you're saying that nothing's wrong when something is wrong, you're expecting them to mind read. So this kind of brings me into my second point, which is that a lot of the time, the women who are expecting their partners to mind read are expecting them to do that because they don't know how to communicate themselves. Because a healthy communicator knows how to say, well, actually, this is what's wrong and this is what's happening inside of me. And when you said this, it brought up this response, etc., etc. They can explain their triggers. They're regulated enough to understand what's going on and to communicate it in a healthy way. So most of the time, the women who just want their partners to just know and to mind read, it is also coming from this underlying inability to communicate and a lack of communication skills. And I also find these women often project that as well onto their partners. I have so many female clients who say to me, my husband is just not a communicator. He doesn't communicate. He doesn't speak. My partner just shuts down. He's not vulnerable. He can't say what's going on. And then when I say to them, oh, well, what did he say when you told him that you were triggered by X, Y, Z, or that you were uncomfortable with X, Y, Z? Oh, I didn't say that. I just stomped around the house and slammed doors. And they're doing the exact same thing that they are projecting that their partner is doing. And so when they say my partner doesn't have communication skills and they can't communicate, it's actually a reflection of themselves and their inability to also communicate. And what you find is when these women, when I start encouraging them to speak up, they can't. They find it so uncomfortable, and they're the ones that feel so uncomfortable being vulnerable. So this lack of communication skills means that they go into sort of like a shutdown response, and instead of just saying what the problem is, they'll shut down and give off this energy of like, I'm fucking pissed off, so that their partner has to be the one to engage and to break it down and to open up the conversation so that they don't have to. But a lot of the time what happens if you're in a relationship with two people who don't have communication skills, you shut down, you get pissed off, you start to give out this bad energy, and they automatically go on the attack and they go, what have I done? She's pissed off at me again. She's not talking to me. I'm sick of this. They shut down and both of your guards go up, and you're not able to actually resolve what's happening because they're being triggered by your shutdown response. And so it's just this vicious cycle that we go through in relationships. So this wanting them to just know comes back to an inability to communicate. The second part is that for me, I have noticed, and I'm sure so many women can relate to this, sometimes I actually don't know what's wrong. And for a long time, I didn't know how to tap into what was wrong. So this is something I've been practicing in a new relationship because it's a healthy relationship where I can practice it. When my partner Gav says to me, something feels off, like you feel a bit like protective, a bit reserved, a bit cold, like what's going on, my automatic response will be like, no, I'm not, I'm fine. And then I'm like, ooh, I'm being that person. I'm definitely not fine. I can feel myself being protective. So now what I do is I stop myself and I start to actually dig into like what actually is wrong, because sometimes our automatic reaction can just be to shut off, to be protective, to just close off to this person. But we don't actually dig into what's happening, what's wrong. And the reason we do this is because when your protective instincts or when your protective like coping mechanisms, when your walls go up, we are in our protective state. And there is this saying that is so true, especially for people with a lot of trauma, which is protection over connection. So most of the time as human beings, we are like wired for connection. We want love, we want acceptance, we want to be a part of the community. But when we feel threatened, our protection comes in before connection. So when that person starts to feel unsafe and the walls go up, your priority is not connection. And so this has to be like a conscious effort. Like you have to make a conscious effort to go back into connection. So now my signal is that when Gav says to me, what's wrong, something's off with you, and my automatic reaction is no, it's not, but I can feel that there's something there, I literally have to sit down and remind myself, okay, connection. We don't need to protect ourselves. He's not the enemy. If I tap back into connection and into love, because if you think of it like protection is fear, connection is love, you're going to choose fear or love. If I tap back into love and I tap back into connection, I'm able to be like, where did it rupture? Where was the moment where I was triggered and where I went from connection and love into fear and into protection? And there's always a moment, right? There is always a moment. But for so long, I didn't actually know what the moment was because it would take me so long to process things. And what I found is that this was because I was going into this shutdown response. So when something triggered me and I was triggered into protection, I would just shut down and basically disconnect from my body. And this is a pretty intense trauma response. Some people do this to like a mild degree. I did this to a very big, in a very big way. So my response was to just shut down, disconnect from my body, disconnect from whatever was going on and go into protection, disconnect. And so it would often take me days to realize that something had upset me. Like I could be cold or distant or just a little bit protective. Like I'd still be doing all of the things, but my energy would be different. I would be a little bit cold before I realized that he had said something or done something that had triggered me 3 days earlier. And when I would finally have the conversation with him and say, oh yeah, this is what's going on, and it would all come up, I would realize that it was days earlier. And it took me that long to just know what was wrong. So when I said nothing was wrong, I actually didn't know what was wrong. I thought that I was just off or just distant, or maybe I was in the wrong relationship and I was considering leaving, maybe he's not my person, all of those things. But what actually happened was there was a trigger that had caused me to shut down. So I didn't know what it was until days later. So my practice has been, when he asks me if there's something wrong, tapping into, is there actually something wrong? And for me, that comes back into coming into my body, coming into how I'm feeling, coming into the thoughts that I'm having, coming into if I really tap in and sit down and think about it, when was the rupture? And if I take that time, because so often we don't take the time, right? we think and think and think and think and spiral in our heads. We don't sit down, take a deep breath, get into our bodies and ask ourselves the question. Since I have been doing that, within minutes, hours of it happening to me, I can be like, oh, this is what triggered me. And 9 times out of 10, maybe 10 times out of 10, if I'm being honest, it's me. It's something old, whether it's from a past relationship, marriage, or whether it's from my dad. There will be something old that has triggered me in this environment that has come up, and it's actually not what's happening in the moment. And for a lot of women, this is the case. Like, yes, we have partners that do things that trigger us and they're in the wrong, definitely. But there are a lot of cases where the things that are upsetting us are wounds from past relationships, wounds from childhood, triggers that we're unaware of that are playing out. So knowing how to tap in, knowing how to sit with it. And when someone says, you know, if your partner says to you, is something wrong, and you say no, and you know that something is wrong, that's a really good indication for you to like sit down and to go inward and to go, what is actually wrong? Which brings me into the last part, which is that we're often doing this as well because we're afraid to speak up, or we're afraid of what could happen if we speak up. So oftentimes in past relationships, when my partner has asked me what's wrong, from past experiences with this person, I know that, well, if I speak up, it's going to get turned around onto me, and it's going to end up in a fight, and it's going to end up in me feeling bad about myself. It's going to end up in me self-blaming. It's going to end up in this toxic cycle. So over time, I just became afraid to just say anything, or just felt almost pointless in saying anything. So there can be women out there who, when your partner is saying to you what's wrong and something is actually wrong, but you're not saying it, it's because you're afraid to speak up, or because you're sick of speaking up, or because you know nothing's going to change. So in that case, I would ask myself, if I am going to speak up now, what is the worst thing that could happen? It's my favorite question. You'll hear me say it on so many podcast episodes. My clients will be like, I know that question well, but what is the worst thing that could happen? And sometimes it's what I just said. If I speak up, I'm going to be shut down. If I speak up, the blame's going to be turned onto me, and then I'm going to be wondering if it is me that's the problem. And so we avoid the conversation altogether because we just can't deal with that. For some people, they're afraid to speak up because their partner will be aggressive and yell, and so it doesn't feel safe for their nervous system to speak up anymore. So they shut down. And if you're asking yourself this question, what's the worst thing that could happen? And the worst thing that could happen is that they turn it back onto you, that they yell at you, that they like hit you, that they hurt you, anything like that, that's a pretty clear indication, obviously, that you're in a toxic relationship. So then we have to look at, well, why are we playing out this pattern? Where does this person, like, who do they remind me of? Why can't I break this pattern? And we go down that path. So sometimes there is this not saying what's wrong because we're afraid to say what's wrong. So asking ourselves that question, what's the worst thing that could happen? One of the most common responses to that question for women that I work with is my partner will crack it and they'll leave me. So there's this other part that doesn't want to speak up because we're afraid of losing this person. And a lot of the time we're afraid of losing this person, but it probably wouldn't be the worst thing if we lost this person. But we're afraid of losing what's familiar. And again, we're afraid to speak up because of this loss equals I will be alone. I'll end up alone. I will not find somebody else. It's coming back to this belief and this fear of being alone. And so in this moment, we self-sacrifice. You self-sacrifice your own needs, you need from that relationship, what you're wanting to speak up about. You push it down because you just want to keep that person. And I feel like a lot of people could relate to this in relationships where you put up with things that you shouldn't put up with because you just want that person to stay with you. You just want that person to love you. Especially in teenage relationships. I find this is really common with women in their teenage relationships. And I was talking about this with a client the other day, and I feel like the reason why so many women that I work with have like the worst relationships of their life in their teen years is because if you've come from a, toxic childhood environment, the first relationship that you get into is going to be most reflective of that, because that's what is, for this first whole part of your life, the most familiar. You're going to move into what is as closely like relatable to that. So we go into those teenage relationships that are so toxic because it's what we're used to. Some women over time can then start to learn from that and get into better relationships as they go. But a lot of the time, those teenage relationships are a direct reflection of that childhood. And what happens is I have countless clients who get into these teenage relationships that are toxic. And what happens is, because they're in these relationships where they're told, you're crazy, why are you worried about that? I didn't do that. They're gaslit. They're told that what they're experiencing isn't true. And they're in these toxic relationships. They start to do what's called self-gaslighting, and they start to believe that they are crazy and that there is something wrong with them. And because you're in such an influential age, like your teenage years, you're so you're moving out of your family and into this relationship that feels like everything. So you're so vulnerable that you take on what this person's saying to be true. And so this can also really shape our future relationships, where we feel like we can't speak up because of what we were told when we were younger in those really formative relationships in our teen years. And obviously childhood, it always comes back to childhood. So if you can't say what's wrong, it could also be something to do with childhood. Like if you were to tell your parents that something upset you and they never took responsibility, and they were always like, oh, you're just a silly little girl and that's not a real problem, and stop crying. And they've always told you that, your problems don't matter and that nothing's wrong. When it is wrong inside of you, you'll learn to shut that part of you down. If your parents are always saying, oh, nothing's wrong, you're fine, eventually you'll start to just kind of feel the emotions and then push them down, and your internal narrative will be like, you're fine, I'm fine. And that's literally what so many women say, right? When their partner's like, what's wrong? Nothing, I'm fine. We learn that from childhood, from our parents saying that to us, and then it just becomes our internal narrative. So when you're saying the words, I'm fine, or nothing is wrong, but you're feeling inner turmoil, that is your sign to sit down and to go, okay, what is wrong? How am I feeling? What's the worst thing that could happen if I said how I was actually feeling? And to actually tap into what's triggered me? What's the emotion that's coming up? Is it anger or rage, or is it sadness, or is it hurt, or is it rejection, or is it what's the feeling that's coming up? And then from that, I would be looking into, where does that come from? When have I felt that the biggest in my life? When did I first feel that? Those are the sorts of self-inquiry questions that we should be asking ourselves to get to the bottom of where this trigger is coming from. So if you have no idea how to do that, no idea where to start, no idea what is actually wrong with you, and you're resonating with all of this, you could also book a session with myself and we can uncover this together. This is what I do. I'm like a little private investigator. We'll go through those layers and figure out where these patterns are coming from, why you can't speak up, why it feels unsafe, why you can't communicate, where that came from, all of those things, and we can get you and your relationship so much healthier. If you know anybody who is saying that nothing's wrong and that they're fine when they are clearly not okay, please send this episode to them, and thank you for listening.